The canopy of Bougainville ruptured as a Japanese bomber tore through the treetops, its frame shuddering under the impact of incoming fire. A line of 50 caliber rounds had found their mark moments earlier, ripping along the fuselage until one of them struck the man seated behind the cockpit window. The commander of the combined fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, had been reviewing a map on his lap when the bullet entered his back and exited beneath his jaw. There was no sound from him after that, only the sudden slackening of his white-gloved hands as the aircraft dipped into its final descent. Smoke spilled behind the engines as the bomber angled downward, smashing into the jungle floor with brutal force. In seconds, steel, palm trunks, and shattered branches mingled into a single mangled ruin swallowed by the greenery. Far from the crash site, inside the operations room at Rabaul, the morning unfolded with its usual precision. Officers moved between desks, headsets crackling with weather updates and patrol position reports. Yamamoto's inspection flight was following a strict timetable. He was expected to appear on schedule, just as he always did. At first, no one noticed the absence. Then a lieutenant checked the clock again. 10 minutes late, then 20. No update, no coded message, just the same routine transmissions that filled every morning. A few officers exchanged brief glances, the kind men share when something feels off, but no one is ready to voice it. Yamamoto had a reputation for absolute punctuality. His tours were planned down to the minute. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, creeping, almost too subtle to acknowledge. But each passing moment pressed heavier on the room. Somewhere beyond the reach of their radios, something had gone wrong. Nearly an hour after the expected arrival, a damaged bomber skimmed across the shoreline near Moila Point, striking the shallows before grinding to a halt. The aircraft was riddled with holes. Hydraulic fluid leaked into the surf as the surviving crew scrambled out. Among them was Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff. He had been meant to travel in the lead plane that day, positioned beside his commander. A last-minute reshuffling, engine load concerns, crew placement, minor calculations that seemed meaningless at the time, had shifted him to the second aircraft. That decision, made casually and without emotion, had placed him just far enough behind Yamamoto to survive the ambush. When rescuers pulled Ugaki from the water, he was bleeding from a cut that stretched across his scalp. One arm hung useless, the other pressed against fractured ribs. Salt stung his eyes as he forced himself upright, refusing assistance. He wanted only one answer. Where did the first plane go down? His voice cut through the noise of rushing waves and groaning metal. The surviving crew couldn't respond. They had seen the attack, American fighters appearing with precision timing, their approach so fast and exact that no signal could be sent. They had barely kept their own bomber in the air long enough to reach the coast. The lead aircraft had vanished into the dense interior, its trajectory disappearing behind towering trees. Ugaki tried to move inland immediately, but collapsed after a few steps. Medics urged him to lie still, but he kept asking about Yamamoto's position, unwilling to accept the void left by the unanswered radios at Rabaul. He knew the Admiral's habits, understood the exacting discipline of the man he served. Yamamoto didn't simply go quiet. If there was no contact, if there was no arrival, the reason had to be catastrophic. Back at headquarters, the tension that had begun as a faint unease had solidified into unspoken alarm. Officers no longer checked the clock, they stared at it. Reports continued to flow in, but none addressed the only question that mattered. Where was the combined fleet's most important commander? The morning that began with rigid order was dissolving into uncertainty, and in that widening silence lay the first tremor of a crisis neither Tokyo nor Rabaul was prepared to face. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. These stories take you deep into the moments that changed the war, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The search began before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough for men to move without collapsing from heat. A detachment of infantry, guides, and naval officers assembled near the shoreline and pushed into the interior without hesitation. They followed the faint trail of drifting smoke they had glimpsed the evening before, though the jungle had already begun to erase it. Vines hung thick across their path, roots curled over the ground like coiled ropes, and every few steps forced them to hack their way forward with machetes. The deeper they went, the more obvious it became that the bomber had not simply fallen. It had carved a violent scar through the canopy. Fragments of metal appeared first, a twisted panel lodged between two trees, a length of wiring tangled around a branch, a section of wing skin torn and blackened. These scattered remnants marked the path of destruction. The men advanced in single file, pausing only when they found pieces large enough to confirm they were on the right track. A broken propeller had embedded itself upright in the earth, its edges still sharp. A navigation chart, soaked and torn, fluttered against a moss-covered log. The smell of burned fuel mixed with the scent of crushed vegetation, creating a heavy atmosphere that clung to their clothes. As they followed the trail uphill, the jungle thickened. The overhead canopy dimmed the light, turning the ground into a muted green world where sound was dampened and every footstep felt too loud. After nearly 2 hours of pushing against this living wall, the lead guide halted and raised a hand. Beyond a screen of ferns lay the main wreckage. Branches had snapped in a wide semicircle, and the bomber's shattered fuselage rested at the center like a broken shell. The front section had been torn away. The rear remained mostly intact, though crumpled by impact. The men approached slowly, aware of the gravity of what they might find. The noise of insects filled the silence as they stepped over fallen parts and navigated the outer debris field. Then one of the officers lifted a hand and signaled the others closer. A few meters from the fuselage, beneath a cluster of leaning palms, sat the body of the combined fleet's commander. Yamamoto remained in an upright posture, as if he had simply paused to rest in the shade. His seat had detached from the interior and landed upright after being thrown free. His uniform, once immaculate, was now marked by the dark stain of blood that dried across the front. But the white fabric had somehow resisted grime and soot, giving him a strangely untouched appearance amid shattered surroundings. His cap had fallen beside him. His sword lay half buried in the leaves. Nothing about his expression showed fear or struggle. Death had come instantly. The men stood around him, unable to speak at first. They knew his face. Every naval officer did. He had been the architect of their early triumphs, the strategist whose decisions shaped everything from Pearl Harbor to the battles across the Pacific. Seeing him here, lifeless and alone in the undergrowth, felt unreal. The contrast between the man's reputation and the quiet finality of this scene weighed heavily on the group. Some bowed their heads, others stared at the ground. No one attempted to move him until a senior officer finally whispered that they must prepare to carry him out. It took hours to construct a makeshift stretcher from wreckage and palm branches. They secured the body carefully, refusing to let the rough terrain disturb him. Moving through the jungle with their burden proved grueling. The heat grew oppressive. Insects swarmed, and every slope felt steeper than the last. But no one complained. 6 men rotated in teams of 2, switching every few minutes to conserve strength. GTH. Their progress was slow, deliberate and respectful, an unspoken acknowledgement of who they carried. By late afternoon they reached the edge of the forest. The coastline shimmered in the distance, and a group waiting near the beach saw the stretcher emerge from the trees. Among those standing there, one figure stepped forward despite a bandage wrapped around his head, and one arm held in a sling. Ugaki had refused to remain in the infirmary. He insisted on witnessing the return of the man he had served for years. Medics tried to steady him, but he brushed them aside and approached the stretcher on his own. For a brief moment he simply stood there, breathing heavily, his clothes stained from his earlier crash. Then he bowed deeply, holding the position for several seconds while his injured arm trembled. He did not say a single word. The men around him looked away, giving him whatever privacy they could offer on an open beach. Later that evening, after being forced back to the medical ward, Ugaki signaled for his diary. Writing was painful. His ribs flared each time he leaned forward, but he pressed on, recording what he had seen. He wrote of Yamamoto's stillness beneath the palms, of the weight that settled on the search party when they realized the war had shifted in a single moment. He described a feeling like something essential had been torn from the Navy, leaving behind an emptiness no replacement could fill. He did not write accusations or anger, only grief and a quiet recognition that the combined fleet had lost more than a commander. Yamamoto had been the one man who balanced bold action with sober understanding, the officer who knew both Japan and its enemy with clarity few others possessed. His absence was not merely the fall of a leader, it was the collapse of a guiding force that had shaped their campaigns from the first day of the war. As night settled over Rabaul, the stretcher-bearers finished cleaning their equipment. The search party dispersed, exhausted, from the day's march. The coastline fell silent except for the waves rolling onto shore. Somewhere in the infirmary, Ugaki lay awake despite the painkillers, replaying the moment he saw the stretcher appear. The shock of that sight lingered, settling even deeper than the injuries he carried. Within hours, word of the discovery began spreading quietly through the base. Officers spoke in hushed tones, unsure how long the truth would remain contained. But for those who had walked through the jungle and those who had watched the stretcher emerge, the reality was already fixed. The man who had shaped Japan's naval war was gone, and nothing in the Pacific would feel the same again. The coded transmission left Rabaul under heavy encryption, routed through layers of security before it crossed the Pacific and reached the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The message was short, clinical, and stripped of emotion, just coordinates, confirmation of a crash, and identification of the body retrieved. But its contents carried a weight the cipher clerks could sense even before it reached the office of Admiral Junichi Kusaka. Kusaka was in his quarters reviewing operational paperwork when the courier arrived. The flimsy paper trembled slightly in the messenger's hands, though the young man tried to hide it. Kusaka opened the document expecting routine updates from the Southeast Area Fleet. Instead, he found a line that froze him in place. His fingers tightened on the edges of the page, and for several seconds he simply stared at the words without blinking. He read the message again, then again. No sound escaped him, but the shock was unmistakable. His posture stiffened, and he rose slowly from his chair as though gravity itself had changed. Yamamoto, the man he had known since they were both junior officers, the strategist who had shaped Japan's entire war plan, was gone. The news felt unreal, like an impossible rumor someone had foolishly allowed onto official channels. Kusaka exhaled once, long and shaky, then folded the message and called for a staff officer. "Send this to the Naval General Staff," he said quietly. "Highest priority." The order moved swiftly through the chain of command until it reached the home of Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff. He had been sleeping for barely 2 hours when aides knocked on his door. A servant ushered the officers inside, and Nagano, still buttoning his uniform jacket, accepted the coded flimsy with a frown. He scanned the first line, then stopped. The color drained from his face. He lifted the papier-mâché, loser to his eyes, squinting as though the darkness of the early morning had distorted the characters. He read the message twice, then handed it to the aide and asked him to read it aloud. The officer did so, voice trembling. The words did not change. The meaning did not soften. Nagano sat down heavily in a nearby chair, the document still in his hand. At 61, he had endured long nights and grim news before, but this was different. This was not a lost destroyer or a sunk freighter. This was the man whose mind had guided the entire Navy for years. The loss was beyond strategic. It was personal, symbolic, and catastrophic. His first question emerged almost automatically, more out of habit than hope. "Has this been verified?" "Yes, sir. Survivor accounts. The remains were recovered." Nagano's second question was more urgent, cutting straight to the heart of the crisis. How many people know? The officer hesitated before answering. Dozens at Rabaul. Possibly more. The search party, the field staff. The information may spread quickly. Nagano closed his eyes. Information was the one resource they could not afford to lose control of. He dismissed the officers and ordered an emergency meeting for 600. He did not return to bed. Instead, he lit a cigarette, staring out at the faint glow rising above Tokyo's eastern horizon. The room felt colder now, though the summer approaching would bring oppressive heat. His thoughts drifted to a conversation he'd had with Yamamoto before the war, a warning that Japan could not outlast America's industry, a warning he had not wanted to believe. Before dawn fully broke, the senior members of the Naval General Staff assembled in a somber, windowless conference room. No one engaged in small talk. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the shuffling of documents and the soft thud of approaching footsteps. When Nagano entered, he plucked, said the coded message on the table but did not read it aloud. Everyone already understood why they were there. "Admiral Yamamoto has been killed," he began. The statement rested in the air like a weight. "His aircraft was intercepted yesterday morning. The body has been recovered." A murmur moved around the table. Shock mixed with resignation. These were men who had planned campaigns with Yamamoto, argued strategy with him, respected his clarity even when they disagreed. Hearing confirmation from Nagano solidified what many feared, but had not dared to imagine. When the murmurs faded, Nagano continued. "We must address two questions immediately: how to manage this information, and how to maintain stability within the fleet." He did not mention the possibility that American forces had intercepted Yamamoto because they knew his exact route. No one else mentioned it either. The implication hung unspoken. If the Americans had targeted the combined fleet's commander with such precision, then their encrypted communications might no longer be secure. But none of the admirals wanted to confront the full meaning of that possibility. Acknowledging it would cast doubt on every operation they had planned. Instead, they turned to what felt manageable: controlling the spread of news. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Navy minister, was the first to break the silence. "We should inform the public immediately," he insisted. "The nation deserves transparency. The people will see Yamamoto's death as heroic. It will galvanize them." Across the table, Admiral Takasumi Oka shook his head. "The effect on morale could be devastating. Our setbacks in the Solomons have already shaken confidence. Announcing this now would appear as confirmation that the tide is turning against us." "Delaying the truth is worse," Shimada countered. "It will buy us time," Oka replied. "We must prepare the narrative carefully. If this news spreads uncontrolled, panic may follow." Nagano allowed the debate to continue for several minutes, watching the tension rise. Every argument carried its own logic, but all skirted the deeper fear none would articulate. Finally, he ended the discussion. "It will remain classified temporarily," he said. "We must appoint a successor first and ensure operational continuity. Once that is secure, we will craft an announcement that preserves national resolve." No one openly objected. The decision provided direction, even if it offered no comfort. A clerk documented the orders, while the admirals stared down at the polished table, avoiding each other's eyes. Each man knew the magnitude of what had happened. Yamamoto had not been just another commander. He had been the embodiment of naval authority, the architect of their strategy, the figure the nation looked to when the war began. Losing him meant losing the one voice capable of shaping the future of the fleet. It meant uncertainty. It meant vulnerability. And though the room remained composed, a quiet understanding spread between them. The foundations beneath their war effort had shifted. As the meeting adjourned, Nagano remained seated, the empty chair across from him reminding him of the colleague he would never speak to again. Officers filtered out into the corridor, whispering among themselves. Outside, Tokyo was beginning to stir, unaware that its most revered naval leader had fallen in a distant jungle. By mid-morning, couriers were already moving between ministries carrying sealed instructions. Orders were dispatched to Rabaul demanding absolute silence. The news would be contained, for now. But every man who had attended the meeting knew what containment truly meant. Delaying an inevitable storm. For the moment, they clung to procedure, hoping structure could mask the instability growing beneath it. But even as they acted with discipline and precision, a dark realization crept along the edges of their thoughts. If the Americans had known where Yamamoto would be, then nothing within Japan's naval command was safe. The appointment came faster than anyone expected. Within a day of the emergency meeting in Tokyo, Admiral Minechi Koga, commander of the Second Fleet, was summoned to the Naval Ministry. He arrived shortly after noon, his uniform immaculate, his expression calm, though he sensed the urgency in the atmosphere. Officers avoided eye contact as he walked past. Conversations tapered off as he passed through the corridors. By the time he reached Nagano's office, he already understood why he had been called. Nagano dismissed the aides and invited Koga to sit. The older admiral's posture was rigid, his features drawn from exhaustion and grief. He handed Koga a copy of the coded message confirming Yamamoto's fate. Koga read it with a steady face, though his knuckles tightened around the page. When he finished, he placed the flimsy on the desk and leaned back slowly. "How did they find him?" he asked quietly. There was no accusation in his voice, only bewilderment and concern. That route was known to so few. Nagano hesitated. He had prepared a dozen explanations in his mind: a chance sighting, an intercepted radio bearing, reconnaissance aircraft roaming the region. But each excuse felt hollow. The truth hovered between them, too devastating to be spoken aloud. "It is under review," Nagano said at last, choosing ambiguity over admission. "We cannot reach conclusions until more information arrives." Koga waited for more, but Nagano offered nothing. The silence between them carried its own message. Something deeper than battlefield misfortune was at play. Something dangerous. Moments later, Nagano stood and bowed his head. Not a gesture of rank, but of resignation. "You are the new commander of the combined fleet. The decision is final." The words struck Koga with a weight that felt almost physical. Yamamoto's shadow loomed over every campaign, every strategic discussion, every officer who had risen through the ranks under his direction. Now Koga was expected to step into that void. He accepted the appointment formally, though inwardly he questioned whether anyone could replace the man he admired and often disagreed with. Even Yamamoto's opponents had respected his brilliance. As he left the ministry, Koga felt the burden settle across his shoulders. The fleet awaited leadership, but every step he took reminded him that he was walking into a position defined by a ghost. While Tokyo prepared for this transition, Ugaki lay in a hospital bed at Rabaul, wrapped in bandages and pain. The order that reached him was delivered with formality. Under no circumstances was he to document the details of Yamamoto's death. No entries in his notebooks, no coded reflections, nothing that could reveal internal turmoil within the Navy. The officer who delivered the directive waited for Ugaki's response, expecting compliance. Ugaki nodded politely, but the moment the door closed, he turned toward the table beside his bed. His diary lay there, partly soaked from the wreck but still intact. He opened it with his good hand, wincing as his cracked ribs protested the movement. He began writing immediately. The characters were uneven, the strokes slowed by pain, but the words poured out steadily. He wrote of the jungle search, the solemn procession back to the coast, and the devastating stillness of Yamamoto's body beneath the palms. He described the overwhelming sense that the soul of the combined fleet had vanished in that crash, leaving the Navy adrift. As the ink dried, he added something he had kept to himself for months: the Admiral's growing fatalism. Yamamoto had spoken often of death recently, not with fear, but with a sense of inevitability. He had insisted on making the inspection flight, despite warnings. He had spoken of fate as if he had already accepted his Imperial. Ugaki closed the diary only when exhaustion overtook him. He knew he was disobeying orders, but he also knew he could not allow the memory of that day to vanish under bureaucratic silence. Meanwhile, in Tokyo and Rabaul, the Navy entered a strange limbo. Word of the death spread quietly through the ranks despite attempts to contain it. Pilots whispered in hangars. Staff officers traded rumors in dimly lit hallways. Sailors speculated aboard ships anchored in distant harbors. Everyone sensed a shift, even if they didn't know the source. Koga's appointment reached the fleet within days, but his authority was overshadowed by the unspoken truth. He was replacing a legend. Officers addressed him with respect, yet their eyes betrayed comparison. Koga felt it each time he entered a room. He carried out his duties with discipline, but privately, he wrestled with the fear that Yamamoto's end was a sign of something larger, a fracture within their operations they could not see. As the days turned into weeks, Tokyo struggled to craft a narrative that could withstand public scrutiny. They needed to announce the death eventually. There was no way to hide the loss indefinitely, but timing mattered. They had to present the event not as a catastrophic blow, but as a noble sacrifice fitting the image the nation held of Yamamoto. 33 days passed. On the morning of May 21, 1943, the announcement finally came. At noon, radios across the empire broadcast the message. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had died in an aircraft while directing operations in the Southern Theater. He had fallen in service to his nation. The impact was immediate. People halted in the middle of trams and marketplaces. Workers stood frozen beside machinery. Many listeners simply lowered their heads as if struck by some physical force. A few wept openly. Others whispered prayers. Yamamoto's name was not merely associated with Pearl Harbor or early victories. It symbolized confidence, defiance, and the belief that Japan could steer its own destiny. Now that symbol was gone. At the Imperial Naval Academy, cadets assembled in formation, stiff and silent. The commandant read the broadcast aloud, his voice faltering halfway through. When he finished, the academy flag was lowered to half-mast. Young men who had memorized Yamamoto's doctrines now stared at the ground, shaken by the loss of the figure they had built their aspirations around. In households across Tokyo, stunned families whispered that if even Yamamoto could fall, perhaps Japan's future was far more fragile than they had been told. Across the Pacific, the reaction took a different form. In Washington, intelligence officers reviewed the Japanese announcement with quiet satisfaction. Operation Vengeance, the interception designed specifically to kill Yamamoto, had succeeded with absolute precision. His death removed the one Japanese commander the Americans truly feared for his ability to adapt, innovate, and sustain morale. Historians would later note that the psychological impact of Yamamoto's death extended far beyond the tactical effect of eliminating a single leader. In Tokyo, morale fractured. Within the fleet, uncertainty seeped into command decisions. Among the public, faith in the war's direction wavered, even if no one voiced it openly. And in Washington, analysts recognized that Japan's naval leadership had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. The shock of Yamamoto's fall did not end with the broadcast. It rippled outward, quiet but relentless, eroding confidence, reshaping discussions, and deepening the cracks already forming within Japan's wartime structure. And for those closest to him, Koga stepping into an impossible role, Ugaki mourning in secret, and Nagano bearing the shame of unanswered questions, the Admiral's death marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. They were powerless to stop. Yamamoto's state funeral in Tokyo unfolded with a level of solemnity and grandeur reserved only for men whose names were woven into the nation's identity. Thousands lined the streets as his ashes were carried past government ministries, military academies and shrines. The procession moved slowly, flanked by officers in full-dress uniforms whose expressions revealed nothing of their internal turmoil. The emperor attended. Cabinet ministers, senior generals, admirals, and statesmen filled the ceremonial hall. Every step of the ritual emphasized respect, devotion, and sacrifice. Yet beneath the immaculate formality, a different atmosphere circulated among the highest ranks. The moment the ceremony concluded and the officials dispersed, a private meeting was arranged in a secluded room of the Navy Ministry. Only a select group of senior admirals were summoned, men who had shaped Japan's maritime strategy for decades. Heavy curtains muted the noise from outside, and guards were stationed at both ends of the corridor to ensure no one overheard what was about to be said. Nagano opened the discussion without ceremony. He was pale, exhausted, and visibly older than he had appeared a month earlier. "We must speak frankly," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Admiral Yamamoto warned us before the war that we were not prepared for the long struggle we now face. He understood the industrial scale of our opponent. He recognized the limits of our strength. We dismissed his caution." The room fell silent. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, but none interrupted. Nagano continued, voice steady but heavy. "We cannot match American production. Our losses are mounting. Our positions grow weaker each month. Yamamoto knew the trajectory. His death is not only a tragedy, it is a signal. We are nearing a point from which we cannot recover." No one contradicted him. The admirals blew, and assessment cut through the layers of pride and propaganda that had shielded them for nearly 2 years. Some averted their eyes. Others stared fixedly at the polished wood of the table. At last, Nagano spoke the words that everyone had been avoiding. "If he were here, he would advise us to seek peace before we lose everything." Shimada bristled. "Peace? Impossible. The public will never accept it. The army will resist it. The political leadership would consider it treason." "I understand the obstacles," Nagano replied, "but that does not change the reality. Yamamoto's absence removes the only voice that could have balanced bold action with sober calculation. We face a war of attrition we cannot win." The meeting drifted into tense debate, but no consensus formed. The truth remained unspoken to the public and the military at large. The Empire's most capable strategist had fallen, and with him vanished the last hope of crafting an exit that preserved the nation's dignity. While Tokyo wrestled with these revelations, Ugaki returned to duty in Rabaul after weeks of recovery. Instead of resuming his position as Chief of Staff, he was assigned to command Battleship Division 1, a respected but noticeably diminished role. He accepted the post without complaint, sensing the political calculus behind the reassignment. Many believed he carried the stigma of survival. He had lived while Yamamoto had died, and that fact created an unspoken discomfort among some in the upper echelons. Ugaki performed his duties diligently, yet privately he continued to write in his diary. His entries grew darker as the months progressed. He documented the steady erosion of Japanese strength, the shrinking fuel reserves, the increasing submarine threat, the loss of island outposts, the constant strain on air crews. Each page carried the weight of impending disaster. In one of his entries, he wrote that Yamamoto's death had pierced the Navy's spirit. The combined fleet still functioned, but without its guiding force, it moved through the war like a ship without a compass, drifting, reactive, and vulnerable. Officers followed orders, but their confidence had withered. Strategy meetings felt hollow. Reports were delivered with mechanical precision, but little hope. Every setback fed the quiet belief that the fleet was sliding toward a conclusion it could not escape. Other admirals shared similar sentiments, though most expressed them in letters rather than official documents. Chuichi Nagumo, once the commander at Pearl Harbor, and the man who had led carrier groups through some of the war's most pivotal battles, wrote to a friend that the Navy had lost its clarity. "We are led," he said, "by officers who see only what they wish to see. Yamamoto saw the whole picture. Without him, we stumble. Nagumo himself would not survive the war. His struggle to reconcile duty with the reality of Japan's worsening situation ended in tragedy when Saipan fell the following year. Many other senior officers met similar ends, killed in battle, lost at sea, or choosing suicide over surrender. Their fates underscored what Yamamoto had foreseen. The Empire had crossed a threshold from which retreat was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American cryptanalysts continued their work. Despite the procedural changes Japan implemented after Yamamoto's death, varying schedules, restricting routes, limiting radio traffic, the core problem persisted. The Americans had penetrated the naval code system so deeply that adjustments did little to hinder them. Intelligence officers could read operational plans, identify reinforcements, track fleet movements, and anticipate deployments months in advance. The advantage was decisive. Through 1943 and 1944, USFO RCs repeatedly struck Japanese positions with uncanny timing. Carrier task forces appeared where they were least expected. Submarine attacks intensified along supply routes. Island garrisons found themselves isolated before reinforcements could arrive. To those witnessing the string of reversals, it often felt as though the enemy was reading their thoughts. Years later, at post-war conferences and reunions, former Japanese officers encountered their American counterparts. The discussions were cordial, but edged with decades-old questions. Eventually, someone would ask the one that had lingered since April 1943. "How did you know where he would be?" The American smiled politely or offered vague replies about reconnaissance, chance reports, or careful planning. They did not disclose the full truth. The details of the code-breaking program would remain buried for decades. Yet the Japanese officers understood. Their intuition had been correct. Yamamoto's death had not been the result of luck. It had been orchestrated with knowledge drawn from their own messages. The realization stung, not because of the tactical loss, but because it confirmed a deeper vulnerability that the leadership had refused to confront during the war. And finally, behind all the official statements, the uniforms and the rituals, lay the truth. No admiral could speak aloud, while the Empire still fought. They praised Yamamoto publicly for his bravery, celebrated his dedication, and declared that his sacrifice would galvanize the nation. Newspapers printed stories of honor. Government broadcasts lauded his legacy. Students recited his words in classrooms. His funeral was framed as a symbol of unwavering resolve. But in the private thoughts of those who had known him best, a different understanding settled in, a realization too dangerous for wartime ears. Yamamoto had been the last figure capable of seeing Japan's true position with clarity. His warnings before the conflict, his strategic insight, his sense of balance between ambition and restraint, these had set him apart. When he died, the Navy did not simply lose a commander. It lost the only man who understood both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of their struggle. His fall marked a turning point from which the Empire would never recover. In their hearts, the admirals knew it. The moment Yamamoto's bomber hit the jungle floor, the war's outcome had shifted irreversibly. They continued issuing orders, planning operations, and maintaining appearances. But behind closed doors, in letters and diaries and quiet reflections, they acknowledged what could not be spoken aloud. Japan had lost not only a leader, it had lost the last chance to steer away from disaster. If you want more untold stories from the Second World War, stories buried in silence and uncovered piece by piece, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts below. Your comments help guide which hidden chapters we bring to life next.